Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. Welcome to what we informally refer to as our Takeout Lounge here in the D.C. Bureau. I want to thank our production and technical crew for making the lounge possible. Peter Welch, Democratic Senator from Vermont, is our guest this week. On most days, today included, Bernie Sanders is a more famous senator from Vermont. But on July 10th of this year, Peter Welch was a very important voice in the Democratic Party and national politics because he published in the Washington Post an op-ed calling for President Biden to step aside, writing at the time, July 10th, that Democrats were in peril. The polling data was moving markedly against the Democrats in, listen carefully, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And that must be taken seriously, the senator wrote, writing also this, quote, "The good news is that President Biden has united the party and created a deep bench that can defeat Trump. Vice President Harris is a capable, proven leader, and we have other electable, young, energizing Democratic governors and senators in swing states." Senator, how did that work out?
Well, it was the right decision that President Biden made to step aside. I have no doubt whatsoever about that. And then, it was so late that we didn't have an opportunity for a primary process. I was for an open process, but the reality is we had an open process. It was very short. There was an enormous surge of support for Vice President Harris, $150 million raised in a day, 100,000 volunteers. And all of those other people I was referring to, the governors, they all endorsed her. So it was a good news in that we united behind a candidate. It was bad news in the sense that it was a short time, very short campaign, I think 107 days for Vice President Harris. But Biden made what is the choice that I think made a difference, not in the outcome of the presidential election, but we held on to Senate seats in tough states like Nevada, like Arizona, like Michigan. So I think in that respect, it made the difference.
Are you saying that if President Biden had remained the nominee, the magnitude of this defeat would have been larger?
Catastrophic.
Is it, how would you describe it now? Near catastrophic?
Well, there's two things, all right? First of all, we're right in the aftermath. I was just with John Tester. I was just with Sherrod Brown, two of our best senators, two of the ones, by the way, most connected to the concerns of working class Americans. So on a personal level, it's terrible to lose them.
This is a very hard time for any losing party. Very hard time.
That's right. But second, as much as it is that we didn't win the House, we lost the Senate, and we lost the presidency. That's a big, big loss. But it actually was still pretty close in many of these states. In those two states where we lost the senators, it was close. So we lost, and we have to acknowledge that. But it's not as though, in terms of the overall vote, we still have a very divided country in a very close situation.
Would this race have turned out differently had President Biden stepped aside sooner, not been a primary candidate, and the party chosen a different nominee much, much earlier, either in 2024 or late 2023?
I don't know if it would have turned out different. What I know is that whoever our candidate was would have had a chance to be vetted and to become better known by the electorate. I think one of the challenges that Kamala Harris had is a challenge anyone would have if you've only been in the campaign for 100 days. People look at you, they like it, then they have some questions, you got to come back, and there's a give and take during which the American people assess you, and then they get kind of comfortable. She just was shortchanged in terms of the amount of time she had. So that's the benefit of a primary. You really do get vetted, and people just go back and forth in terms of looking you over in a variety of different situations. I mean, think about what Obama went through. Think about what Bill Clinton went through. And they started out, neither of them were expected to win. And in the course of the combat of that primary, they persuaded people they were the best candidate. It turned out they did a good job for us.
I'll talk to you about your neck of the woods. So in Vermont in 2020, Biden carried the state by 16. Harris carried it by 12. New Hampshire, Biden carried it by 8. Harris carried it by 3. Maine, Biden carried it by 9. Harris carried it by 7. Massachusetts, Biden carried it 34. Harris carried it 25. New York, Biden carried it 23. Harris by 12. What does that tell you, Peter Welch?
We've got to look in the mirror. I mean, here's the irony that is painful. all right, for Democrats. We had a president in Biden, in the Biden-Harris administration, who I think demonstrably were as pro-worker, as pro-union, as pro-middle class as any president we've had since FDR. And if you just look at the legislation, it really was consequential. But on the other hand, as much as we may not like to acknowledge it, Trump had a visceral connection that he made with a lot of folks who are really concerned about paying their bills at the end of the month. And that is a huge problem, a result of this massive income inequality that we have in our country. So he made that connection better than we did, better than Harris did. Now, his prescriptions are going to make things worse, in my view. Tax cuts for billionaires, tariff, which is in effect a tax increase. It will cost the average Vermont family about $3,500 if his policy goes into effect. But the reality is, how do we connect better? Because Trump did it, even if his prescriptions, as I see it, are detrimental to the interest of everyday working and middle-class Americans.
So more middle class and more pro-worker than Bill Clinton or Barack Obama.
Well, and also there's an attitude
Two-term
here.
Democratic presidents, but one term out for someone who you would say on policy, by comparison, superior to both.
Well, he got the incredible things done with the Infrastructure Act, the COVID Relief Act, things that made a difference. Now, he had also the burden of being, we had the burden, and I think Harris bore this because she was seen, obviously, identify with the Biden-Harris administration, of being a post-COVID candidate. And what we've seen around the world is that the incumbent parties, whether they were considered very liberal or very conservative, took a hit, a bad hit. They got booted, all right? So that was true here. And, you know, the reality is that the inflation, it's just punishing for everyday families. And yes, inflation is down now, but when folks are looking at $7 eggs instead of what was $2.50 eggs, when the cost of borrowing makes it really tough to afford a car, you know, that's real, and that hasn't gone away. So inflation is down, but the prices are still up, and I think that was that was a real challenge for an incumbent
And when the White
party.
House described inflation when it was rising as transitory, some people found that either indifferent or elitist.
It was a huge mistake, all right? And also, here's the thing that I think is counterintuitive. On paper, the Biden administration could make a compelling case that they improved the economy. You know, the stock market's really high, unemployment's really low. Wages actually were going up. They were going up for African Americans as well. But that didn't connect with a family sitting down at the end of the month, doing their bills, and coming up short. And you have to have that emotional connection with the challenges that the people you want to represent are really experiencing day in and day out. So it was always making me nervous when we were, quote, bragging about the economy, because it was great for some folks. But for the vast majority of people who literally depend on their salary or their wages, their hourly wages, it was tough, and it still is. And of course, this whole affordability issue, you know, the cost of housing, you know, and I tell a story. When I went to Vermont,
I'm going to ask you to stop with that story because I don't want to cut you off because we're right up on near a break. So when we come back, we're going to get that story, and we're going to talk about the early days of the incoming Trump administration and some of the picks for cabinet positions announced thus far. I'm Major Garrett. Peter Welch, Democratic Senator from Vermont, is our special guest. Segment 2 of the Takeout coming your way in just a minute.
he was convicted, he was indicted, and he was impeached, and he won.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Thanks to our viewers on CBS News 24/7 and Paramount Plus. Hope you're enjoying the Takeout Lounge, which we informally call the setting in our D.C. bureau. Peter Welch, Democratic Senator from Vermont, is our guest. You were about to tell me a story.
Well, it's about affordability and how things have changed. When I got out of law school, I had a chance to work on Wall Street, K Street, or Market Street. I went to law school in California, and you get good salaries there. I ended up on Bridge Street in White River Junction. All right, I made $9,000. But when I showed up in White River, I could get an apartment for $135, and there were a lot of apartments to choose from. I didn't have massive student debt, so I had options. I became a public defender. If Peter Welch went to Vermont now, there's no housing. If you want to get an apartment, it's going to be $2,500, maybe $3,000, and you probably have significant student debt. So that's the reality for a lot of people. So I gave an example of some young person starting out who might want to do public service and not just make the most money they possibly can. But if you're a family and you got a couple of kids and you're trying to balance things and you're stuck in a house that's too small for you, but the mortgage rates have gone way up, and the cost of so many things has gone up, that's really, really tough. And there's a lot of reasons that happened. But any of us who want to provide leadership have to be able to show we really get it, that it's tough for people who are working hard and have that anxiety about whether they'll be able to pay their bills.
Back to your July 10th Washington Post op-ed, you wrote this, quote, "Trump is a felon. He is a pathological liar. He is a menace. And he is sure to be emboldened by his activist Supreme Court, which granted him near total immunity." You care to retract any of those remarks?
Well, he was convicted, he was indicted, and he was impeached, and he won. So the reality is he won this election despite those things, and he won it fair and square. So he was not just squeaking in. He got a majority of the popular vote and, of course, the Electoral College vote. So that's the decision of the American people we have to deal with. But everything I said then, I believe now. I mean, it's not, do I believe it? That's true. He was indicted, impeached, and convicted.
Do you think in any way those legal cases made him politically stronger?
You know, I do in some ways, because Trump's unique. And you have to give him some credit for this capacity he has to dominate the news. And it would be news stories that would doom most of us, right? Where we'd at least be embarrassed. And but what I think he does do, and did effectively here, is he connects with the discontent people have who are suspicious about, quote, the system and whether it's delivering for them. And that's a real danger to us, because I do believe that we have to have institutions that have credibility with the American people. The press, it's better if we have a press that people believe in. It's better if we have a Supreme Court that people are willing to accept their decisions.
Federal courts, state courts, local courts.
Exactly, and that's true in the political process. But when you have a situation in the country where there's two different realities, partly because of social media, but also partly because the economy has done really well for a segment of our population, but it's a real struggle for folks who are going paycheck to paycheck. And, you know, what's the system delivered for me, even though they're willing to work hard? That kind of creates the seeds of distrust. And I think Trump, we have to acknowledge, I think, has tapped into that. And from my perspective, I acknowledge that, but I really see his tax cut policy that is so much for the rich, the tariffs that are going to increase taxes for the middle class. That's really, I think, going to accelerate the problem. But we have to have a way of connecting, and that's the challenge that we face right now.
Is the lesson, or one of the lessons from this election, that anyone who is a nominee or near nominee should never be indicted, no matter what?
Wait, he was indicted.
Right, but if it made him politically more powerful, should it not have happened in the first place?
Well, that was the impeachment.
No, but I mean the New York case.
Oh, I see.
Bragg's
I
case,
was misunderstanding your question. You know, that was the house.
the Georgia case,
Right.
the Jack Smith case.
In this, you know, this was a real dilemma.
The system says this is about accountability. Trump supporters say, no, it's about persecuting someone in a political arena.
Exactly. And that was always a
So
jump
the
ball.
lesson be you should never seek accountability if they're popular politically?
I don't think we can accept that. I think all of us have to be accountable. But this did show how politicized even the judicial system became. So if you have a judicial system that doesn't have credibility, then politically it's going to be is it your guy indicted? And it was bogus in that case. If it's your opponent who is indicted, hallelujah. All right. So that's about trust. And by the way, that gets to, the real challenge here, and I think we saw it from January 6th, is the most important thing in a democracy is not even the Constitution, as important as that is. It's the mutual trust that is required for a democracy to function, so that if you trust that person you disagree with, trust them that they'll accept certain norms, that they'll accept the outcome of an election, knowing that they can fight another day and beat you the next time around. That trust is so essential. And that's what worries me more than anything else, is this erosion of trust in one another and trust in our institutions. Now, each of us has to earn trust, okay? And institutions have to be accountable in order to maintain trust. So this notion that you can cast aside accountability because it's inconvenient is not something I subscribe to.
How does all of what you said factor into your consideration of Matt Gaetz as a potential attorney general in the United States?
Well, first of all, my inclination is to give the benefit of the doubt to the president's nominees, but not a blank check. Matt Gaetz, number one, we'd like to, I think that's an in-your-face nomination by the president. And the thing that worries me the most is the president said that he's going to go after political adversaries. That's really, really a bad thing to do. But if he is going to do that, the guy who's born to do it is Matt Gaetz. And the last place a person like that should be is the Attorney General in charge of the dispassionate, impartial application of law. And I know there's a lot of consternation, not just among Democrats, but many of my Republican colleagues. So I doubt very much that he'll ever take the oath of office as AG.
You doubt he'll be confirmed?
I do.
Should the House Ethics Committee investigation, which now has been stopped because he has resigned his position in the House, be handed over to the Senate Judiciary Committee?
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a person who's going to be our chief law enforcement officer. The whole point of advice and consent is to do a review for the qualifications and the character of the candidate, and then for the whole Senate, by the way, the whole Senate, Republicans and Democrats, to have an opportunity to vote yes or no. And obviously, this is very relevant information. This report, as I understand, is completed, and the only reason it's not released is because Matt Gaetz resigned, so the committee no longer has jurisdiction. But Senator Durbin has requested it, and I think all the members of the Senate are entitled to take a look at that.
You used to serve in the House. If the House says, hey, wait a minute, this is our thing, not yours, Senate, would you respect that decision?
No, I don't, because it's a different situation now. I mean, they have their procedures, and there's no more jurisdiction because Gaetz resigned. But now there's an independent decision for the U.S. Senate. Should we confirm this individual? The House has very relevant information. It's not as though this would have been secret. The only reason it wasn't released is because Matt Gaetz got out of town before the ink was dry. So the American people are entitled to know what the deal is with Matt Gaetz.
The voice of Peter Welch, Democratic Senator from Vermont. We'll continue our conversation. Segment 3 of the Takeout coming your way in just a second.
With the President Trump, it's pretty clear his policy will be bombs away. Whatever Netanyahu wants to do, he's going to be okay with.
Welcome back to Takeout. Peter Welch, Democratic Senator from Vermont, is our guest. Great to have you with us. Continuing our conversation, we offer a couple of names identified by President-elect Trump for significant positions in his incoming administration. Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary.
Well, he'll be the first Fox News host to serve as the Defense Secretary. So I have my questions about him. Look forward to the hearing.
Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence.
Who had a personal visit with Assad of Syria during the height of the slaughter. I look forward to her hearing.
Do you think either of those two that I just mentioned are confirmable?
I have my doubts. What I said earlier, I give the benefit of the doubt to the president. I want a president to have as much latitude as reasonably possible to pick his team. And I would apply that to Trump, even though I was opposed to his election. But not a blank check. And these are getting pretty close to the blank check category for me. So we've got to go through the process. But what's disturbing to me is that these are extraordinarily important positions for the welfare and security of the people of the entire country, whether you're from red state Indiana or blue state of Vermont. We need the best. And the best usually has a lot of experience. And it's not just experience in the policy area, it's experience of running a large, complex organization. And, to Defense Secretary, having been a very successful media personality is not necessarily a transferable skill. Matt Gaetz is barely a lawyer, as I understand it, and has made a name for himself as a firebrand, not as an impartial adjudicator of justice. So these stretch the limits. I'll put it that way.
And they also emphasize what President-elect Trump has said quite clearly over and over is his number one criterion, loyalty.
Exactly, which is bad, because what loyalty should include is candor. Loyalty should include, boss, you're going too far.
And loyalty to something other than the individual.
That's correct. And, I think strong and confident leaders want loyalty to the mission. And the mission of the President of the United States is to serve the welfare and well-being of all of us, not just to...
And to live within the confines of the Constitution.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Inconvenient as that may be at certain times. That's exactly right.
What is your level of concern about the President-elect's advocacy for recess appointments and having the Senate essentially adjourn so he can appoint whomever he wants to wherever he wants it appointed to and get it?
No. The Senate should do its job. The House should do its job. The President should do its job. We should not be interfering and telling the President what he can do when it's within the prerogatives of the President. We can express our opinions. We can pass legislation. But the United States Senate, to be an independent institution, whether it's in Republican majority or Democratic majority, has to maintain its responsibility for advice and consent and not just be a yes man for whoever that president is.
What's your level of concern that that's what's going to happen? Under pressure, Senate Republicans yield that long-standing, and I mean standing from the Federalist Papers, advice and consent authority.
You know what I'm happy to say? I don't think they'll do that.
Okay.
I think John Thune, who was just elected, is an outstanding member of the Senate. I think he's a loyal Republican. He's very effective. But I think he profoundly understands that this institution has responsibilities to the American people.
And it would be irrevocable.
It would be irrevocable. That's right.
It would never come back.
Right. That's exactly right. And I have confidence that my Republican colleagues, and I've got to be nice to them. They used to have to be nice to me. Mm-hmm. But I think John Thune and the Republican majority will absolutely insist on maintaining what's required for the Senate, the United States Senate, to be that voice for the American people in the system of checks and balances that is so essential to the well-being of our democracy.
Mike Huckabee has been named by the president-elect as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. He doesn't like to use the terminology Gaza or West Bank. He likes to use the terminology that's much more ancient, Samaria. He's talked openly about Israel taking back the West Bank, occupying it. Doesn't seem to be all that concerned about Gaza in terms of Palestinian sovereignty or semi-sovereignty or aspirational sovereignty. Any concerns about Mike Huckabee and Trump administration policy?
I have grave concerns about the Trump administration policy. The United States is a strong supporter of Israel. We've been there from the beginning. I support Israel as a democratic and Jewish state. What's happening in Israel is, and we've always supported, we, the country, Republican and Democratic administrations have supported a two-state solution. Independent, Jewish, secure state of Israel, an independent, peaceful, really disarmed Palestinian state. Trump is going to challenge that. There are very strong forces in internal Israeli politics, including Netanyahu, that wants a one state. They want to annex the West Bank, and they want to take over Gaza. I oppose that. I don't think that's a prescription for the long-term stability and strength of Israel or, obviously, the West Bank. So my objection here is not so much about Huckabee. It's an objection to that policy. And whoever the Trump administration appoints is going to be consistent with the Trump view of what should be policy. And I clearly disagree with the one-state approach that appears to be developing in the Trump administration.
How would you characterize your frustration, if it exists at all, with Democratic voters who are unhappy with the Biden-Harris approach to Gaza, opted out on this election, or either voted for Trump, didn't vote at all, or voted third party?
Well, I'm frustrated with that. You know, you have a choice in an election, and I happen to disagree that with the full-throated support and continued providing offensive weapons to Israel for the attacks in Gaza. And in fact, Benny Gantz, their recently deposed defense minister, has said, we have achieved all we can militarily in Gaza. And I think there's a lot of sensitivity among many Americans about the massive loss of innocent life, you know, enormous horror at what Hamas did. Horror. And prosecuting Hamas, there's nothing we can do to them that they don't deserve. But there's so many innocent Palestinians. 43,000 have died, 100,000 severely wounded, so many children. And then there's famine now that's starting to occur, and disease.
International aid organizations describe it as a famine happening before our very eyes.
That's right. So from my perspective, there's a lot to be disappointed in with the failure of the Biden administration to use the leverage it has with Netanyahu to reduce the loss of innocent life. And some folks then took the next step and wouldn't vote for him as a result of that. I disagree with that, even if I understand where they're coming from, because with the President Trump, it's pretty clear his policy will be bombs away. You know, whatever Netanyahu wants to do, he's going to be okay with. That's my sense of the direction that Trump is going. And he's talking about a one-state solution, which is going to create enormous suffering. And by the way, I think and instability.
Instability in the region.
That's right.
So I've got about 30 seconds, so I'm going to set this up, and I'll give you about 10 or 15 seconds on Ukraine. Where do you think things are heading in the waning days of the Biden administration and with Trump? And take that a little bit, and then we'll stop and we'll re-engage.
Number one, we should stick by Ukraine. What Putin has done is violated the post-war tradition. You don't invade a neighboring country because you're bigger and because you want it. And I believe it's absolutely essential that we and our European allies stick with the efforts of Ukraine. This is tough, and the suffering has occurred mostly in Ukraine with the loss of life. Clearly, the Trump administration, and particularly through what we're hearing from J.D. Vance, is they may pull the plug. I think that's a big mistake.
We'll stop you right there. We'll continue that conversation on the other side of the break. Peter Welch, Democrat from Vermont, is our special guest. We'll see you in a minute for segment 4.
The real challenge for people is a skepticism about not whether climate change exists, not whether we have to go to clean energy, but can we afford it?
Welcome back to the Takeout. Peter Welch, Democratic Senator from Vermont, is our guest. It's great to have you, and I want to continue the conversation on Ukraine. Anything that the Biden administration or the lame duck Congress can do to fortify U.S. support for Ukraine before President-elect Trump is sworn in?
Two things. Number one, get the money out the door. Number two, give authorization to Ukraine to use the weapons we are sending to strike deeper into Russia as long as the target are military bases that are being used to fire missiles at innocent civilians in Ukraine. So get the money out the door and give authorization for deeper strikes to military targets.
Something the administration has been reluctant and opposed to.
That's correct. And I support
Wrongly?
In my view, yes. I think we've got it. Look,
Tying the Ukrainians' arms.
yeah, you've got Russia is using a terror.
Savaging them.
They're savaging, and they're targeting schools, right? There's
Infrastructure,
and
the
civilians.
essentials to life.
That's right. And why can't you fight back? And we're talking about permission to use those to strike the targets from which the missiles are being fired within Russia, not going after civilians. So I do think that we ought to absolutely give Ukraine that authority.
I want to read to you something that's posted by the Oxford University Bioscience Organization, October 2024. Quote, "We are on the brink of an irreversible climate disaster. This is a global emergency beyond any doubt. Much of the very fabric of life on Earth is imperiled. We are stepping into a critical and unpredictable new phase of the climate crisis." It goes on to say, "We find ourselves amid an abrupt climate upheaval, a dire situation never before encountered in the annals of human existence." Do you agree?
Well, I do agree.
Do you think any of that is catastrophizing?
Well, look, in Vermont in July of 23, we had terrible floods that wiped out houses and farms and businesses. July of 24, we had the same thing, another set of floods. Some of my Republican colleagues...
Wildfires in Brooklyn.
New York City. And then, I mean,
New
the
Jersey.
devastation in North Carolina with that hurricane,
and
Helene.
Milton. Yeah.
So people get it. That
Do they?
I think whether they believe in what exactly the scientists say about climate change, they're living in a community that used to be safe and now isn't as a result of catastrophic weather events. So that's real. Now, my view, with Trump he thinks in 400 years maybe there'll be a 1/4 inch of sea level rise. Obviously, he's not the scientist, but he also thinks that'll create more beachfront property, all right? Well, that's kind of a silly and irresponsible point of view, but I still have some optimism here, and this is a tribute to the Biden administration. The Infrastructure Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act did so much to unleash private investment. For the first time, we had policies and incentives behind moving to clean energy. And my view is that the real challenge for people is a skepticism about not whether climate change exists, not whether we have to go to clean energy, but can we afford it? And the only way we can afford it is to unleash the private sector that comes up with technological capacity. So you've seen like the price of wind has come way down, solar way down. So we have to continue this. And with the Infrastructure Act, we can. And the Democrats, by the way, have to make some changes here because we've got to lighten up on the permit process. Democrats, we've got to speed it up because we've got to build things like your transmission systems. If you're producing wind in Texas, but you need to get it to Detroit, you have to have a way to do it. So I think we can continue the effort, even though we'll have a lot of the opposition from the president himself, but the private sector has been unleashed. Goldman Sachs says there's going to be about $3 trillion in investment in clean energy. So they see market opportunities out there to make it affordable for everyday folks to be able to.
To what degree are you concerned that an incoming Trump administration would unwind any component parts of the Infrastructure Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, which had not only incentives, but credits and real dollars to address these issues?
I think they'll try to do it, but I think they'll fail. And
They'll fail, okay.
Yeah. 60% of the incentives that have been out the door are in red districts.
Red states.
Red states.
They like it.
And what's to dislike about a good job, right? The chip plant is in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district.
In Georgia, North Georgia.
Yeah, so you have people who now, it's not just a selfish thing. It's in my district and I want it. But it's showing that actually it can work. It can be affordable. If you don't have an affordable option and your concern every month is paying the grocery bill and balance in the checkbook, you can't afford the luxury of a clean energy option if that means you're increasing your expenses and not saving money. But with the investments that are now being made, both by taxpayer incentives and also by the private sector who sees opportunity, that affordability equation works out for the average person. And once you have that, you'll see, I think, the Trump administration backing off from taking away something that's a good thing in red districts.
When he was in the Rose Garden, President Biden said, "So many of the things that we enacted are just getting started." Do you think the Biden administration will live for the next 10 years, even through the Trump administration?
Oh, yes, I do. No, these projects are long term. You know, think back to like the interstate system. You know, people give credit to Eisenhower, rightly so. That took a long time to build. There was a greater consensus around its need. But there's been generational benefits from something that a visionary president did and died before the full appreciation of his wisdom was understood by the American people. And I think that Biden is going to rightly be revered for what he did with this, not only because of the jobs it created, but how it's changed the whole conversation so that there is active public and private commitment to bringing down the cost of that transition we have to make to cleaner energy.
1 minute. Elon Musk and the federal government. What's your level of concern?
Huge concern. I mean, the guy's a genius, right? Tesla, SpaceX, in the satellites.
Starlink, yeah.
Starlink. But that doesn't make him the guy to come in and do the so-called efficiency in government. And he's hanging around the president, likes having near, this guy may be a trillionaire before it's over. But what's his interest? What are his public policy points of view? What does he know, really?
Does he want to defang every recall notice or investigation or regulatory reach into his many companies?
That's right. And those companies are very much involved in national policy, not just his own personal interest and personal balance sheet. But, you know, what we're doing with Ukraine, very much tied up with him. Our satellite system and space program, very much tied up with him. So he shouldn't get special consideration, even if we have to work with him.
Peter Welch, Democratic Senator from Vermont. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for your Takeout, Outtake Especial. We'll see you next week, folks.
I like country music, you know. I kind of like the older stuff, the Willie Nelson stuff.
Welcome to your Takeout, Outtake Especial. We have done this for almost the entire history of the show, but sometimes I don't do it because I weave in some other newsy questions. We're going to do it this week. So Senator Welch, Democrat from Vermont, 3 questions we usually ask our guests. Take them in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? All-time favorite movie? And you're on a long flight or a long drive and you're really going to dig some music. What artist or genre is that going to be?
Well, I love War and Peace.
War and Peace.
Yeah, I did.
Tolstoy.
It was Tolstoy.
Bringing it.
But it was all.
It takes a while, folks. It's not an overnight. It's not a nighttime read.
Yeah, and I don't know that I have the patience for it now, but I you know, it was life and love.
Set aside a month.
Yeah, set aside a month. But I love War and Peace. My favorite movie is Clint Eastwood, Unforgiven.
Unforgiven. Okay.
Yeah.
Because.
You know, it was.
Takes the Western and reappraises that genre?
It was just this incredible, Gene Hackman, of course, and he was a sheriff, kind of a nasty guy, and he was now finally settling down in life and wanted to build himself a cabin, and he wanted to get away from everything he'd done, and he was doing his level best. And then Clint Eastwood was a former kind of a killer cowboy, and he was trying to raise his kids on his ranch, and bad things happened, and they ended up both going back to what they had really tried to get away from.
They tried to get away
and
from.
It just showed the pull of who you are never leaves who you are, and just the struggles that they went through.
Music?
Well, I like country music, you know.
Old or new?
I kind of like the older stuff, the Willie Nelson stuff, you know. So that would be my genre.
First Hank Williams. George Jones.
Oh, my God. Yeah, George. What a voice. That's right. But that's where I like to be.
Excellent. Peter Welch, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Folks, hope you enjoyed your Takeout, Outtake Especial on the show itself. Again, Many thanks to our production and technical crew for putting together the Takeout Lounge here in the DC Bureau. We'll see you next week.